The lockdown. Like so many people who lived in his area, Nick was under lockdown. The COVID-19 virus was wreaking havoc on man and beast. For their own safety, the authorities encouraged everyone exposed to the killer to seek shelter and quarantine themselves. Nick lived alone. He stayed confined in his tiny third-floor apartment, which was not far from the municipal park. Besides his job, his morning ritual consisted of watching the news, checking social media sites, and ordering food deliveries and urgently needed sundry items to endure the plague. His evening activities were no different. Many of his apartment neighbors were in the same boat. As Nick looked at the drab furnishings in his surroundings, he felt lucky being able to work from home. His vocation was as a graphic designer, and he could access his assignments through the computer. Though many employers encouraged their staff to work from their residence, frontline workers did not have that luxury. Their exposure put them at risk for COVID as the rising epidemic took its toll from persons who disrespected them by not wearing their masks or intentionally trying to infect them. Those same persons even distorted the truth about the vaccines. Misinformation ran amok and rampant. They made ridiculous statements saying that the government was trying to inject a tracing device into them or questioned the safety and effectiveness of the shots. They essentially tried to take over the job of the federal agency responsible for that activity. They said they wanted to do their own research on the injections, as if they had millions of dollars, the know-how, or hundreds of hours to do it. But as we all know, they didn't. But that didn't stop them from spreading the big lies. Anti-vaxxers was their names, and questioning science was their game. It was a mess, and everyone suffered from the mix-up. Even some die-hard politicians, as well as the right-leaning media companies, perpetuated the false claims. One day, while listening to the news, Nick heard that worldwide, almost 5 million people had died from the virus, over 700,000 in the United States alone. What more proof do you need of danger? Nick thought. But he felt protected because he had had his vaccines, and he only wished that others would comply. He especially felt sorry for those who could not get them, including prisoners in the city jail confined to their 6 by 8 foot enclosures. They were particularly vulnerable. The limited space they had reminded Nick of the cramped quarters of his apartment. For that reason, he had sympathy for them, but none for the doubters who refused the vaccine and suffered the consequences. While Nick and millions of others endured the daily grind and drudgery, he remembered that before the virus hit, his most treasured activity was riding his bike to and through the park. Now he could only enjoy seeing it from his apartment window. He opened the portal. Below was the inviting scene. Though the street below was quiet and bare, the sun's daily arc across the vista highlighted the preserve. The foliage with its varied green textures was beckoning. Occasionally, the scent of sweet honeysuckle wafted its way to his building, tempting him even more to venture into the green space, but he never did. The migratory birds stationed at the rookery inside the park made such a chatter that it was another feature that brought him pleasure. And though unseen from his vantage point, he remembered the lake with its cascading waterfalls. He missed the park dearly, especially after looking at his bicycle, which seemed to call him. It was sitting in the corner of the apartment. It was a vintage Schwinn bike that he had had since he was a child. It had a banana seat and motorcycle handbars. He loved that bike and vowed never to get rid of it. He knew he got unusual stares from pedestrians as he rode by. This big guy on this little bike? But he didn't care. Before the virus, he and his mechanical companion would ride effortlessly through the park. Now they both had signs of inactivity due to the lack of access to the sanctuary, the paunch he had developed on his abdomen, and the flatness of the bicycle's tires. Nick also missed physical contact with his friends. The only way that he could keep up with them and their activities was through emailing and texting. Still, he wondered if some deranged hacker was developing a new crop of viruses to even interfere with that. Even FaceTiming was suspect. Day by day, it was the same routine: hunker down from the virus and pretend to live an everyday life. The lockdown was taking its toll on the population, both physically and mentally. One morning he woke up to resume his monotonous activities. When it seemed as though things couldn't get any worse, he was pleasantly surprised by what was reported in an early morning news briefing. An on-air city official announced that the lockdown was lifted due to the falling number of COVID cases. He said people should resume their normal activities, but encouraged them to continue wearing their masks when in close contact. Finally, Nick yelled with excitement. His proclamation was so loud that neighbors, as well as passerbys who had come out of hibernation, could hear him. He felt that he and other inhabitants of the city had been given a new lease on life, and a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. He was exhilarated. It was the weekend, and for once, he had an opportunity to do something outside. What should I do? He thought as his mind was a mix of emotions. He was happy to be alive, but saddened by the thought of millions who were not as fortunate as he, succumbing to the virus. He ran over to the window and pulled up the sash. From his perch, he heard and saw the street below thriving with activity and life. The rhythmic beat of music coming from a boombox carried by two teens, neighbors chatting while taking a stroll with their pets, and even vehicles parading up and down the street with their smelly fume exhausts were everywhere. Beyond the torrent of activity sat the municipal park in all its glory. I know, he again thought as he looked at his two-wheeled companion sitting in the corner. I'll take the bike for a spin. We'll go riding in the park just like we used to do. After getting dressed and eating a light meal, he combed through some old accessories that he had stored in a closet and found a bike tire pump. The metal tube and hosing made a swishing sound as the tires responded to the airlift. He was in such a hurry to take a ride that he forgot his wallet as well as other forms of identification. He also forgot his protective bike helmet. Nick maneuvered the bike out of the apartment, hoisted it over his shoulders, walked down several flights of stairs, and finally wheeled it through the complex's lobby. Eyes again were stirring upon him. What's that old guy doing with that old bike? Some seemed to suggest. But as before, Nick gave it no concern. He felt free to pursue his passion. He finally rolled the bike out the door, down the stoop, and onto the street. A few of his neighbors had the same idea in mind as they motioned their way to the thoroughfare with their bikes in hand. As he passed through, one of them gave Nick a thumbs up as if he was part of a secret tribal society. Hell's Angels they weren't, but still, they shared some camaraderie around biking. When his path was clear, Nick climbed on his trusty steed. The bike responded by moving faster and faster as his feet pedaled the chain link harder and harder. Though his vintage bike didn't have modern conveniences found on newer bikes, such as derailleurs, chain rings, or cassettes of sprockets, it still was able to move forward at a steady pace. As Nick rode around the town, his bike allowed him to ride from flat terrains to hilly surfaces and back down to level ground. While trying to get to the park, he encountered a pack of bikers. Some were moms and pops with small children riding bicycles with training wheels, and some were adults with their tiny tykes sitting in child bike seats. Middle and older age bikers were also amongst them. There were also squads of seasoned bikers as part of a racing team wearing coordinating outfits. In the group, some riders had older and newer models of Spins, as well as other models of bikes, including Huffies, Fujis, and even giants. They all varied in color from glistening snow white to jet black and every shade in between. Some were multicolored, with reds and blues clashing with purples and yellows. Some rode road bikes, some rode mountain bikes, and some even rode English racers and electric bikes. There were utility, fitness, folding, dirt and gravel bikes, and even a couple riding a bicycle built for two. Everyone was wearing their protective helmets, which Nick didn't seem to notice. He followed the bike enthusiast. Riding gave him a sense of freedom. Traveling to areas that he had never explored before on his bike gave him the confidence of knowing that he was the king of his destiny, and no one could take that away from him. Though his hair was short, he could feel the breeze blowing through his locks. And like a giddy schoolchild, when the bike's pedals were at the 3 and 9 o'clock position, he splayed his legs to feel the drag of warm air. He continued to follow the bikers. Riding the bike brought back childhood memories, some good, some not so good. Like the time the neighborhood dog was chasing him and his brother David. Butch was the pooch's name, and he was the dog bully of the block. The canine chased them every time they rode through the area until finally it got hit by a passing car. The animal must have learned from the accident because, after that, it stopped chasing them. From then on, when they rode through that same area, they observed the dog only from afar as it sat quietly on its owner's porch. I vaguely remember it walking with a limp after that, Nick thought. And then there was the incident with the police, Nick remembered. But before allowing the memory to surface completely, he noticed a fork in the road ahead. All of the riders continued on the well-worn path, while Nick decided to take the road less traveled. It was a scenic route to the lake and its waterfall. But due to the lack of maintenance because of COVID, the road and the surrounding area were strewn with garbage, trash, overgrown weeds, abandoned appliances, and other discarded debris. The site was not as pristine as he once remembered it. At the time, he was the only traveler on the course, which by then had turned into a gravel pathway. As Nick rode, enjoying the scenery, all of a sudden, from behind, the sound of a police cruiser and its siren startled him. The vehicle had the city's emblem on it, along with the decal and the numbers 5 and 4, which identified the car. Nick initially thought that the pursuers were chasing someone else and sending notice, but the vehicle bird-dogged him. He knew he wasn't speeding or doing anything else that would arouse the attention of the authorities. This is like a bad movie, he thought as he stopped in his tracks. It's like a book I once read, Driving While Black, but I'm riding my bicycle. 2 officers sat in the interior, one white, and to Nick's surprise, the other was black. Neither were wearing protective masks. They leaned towards each other as if having a private conversation. Then they both exited the car and approached Nick.